Greetings, class. This lecture is on Chapter 30, Section 4, which is on the Soviet Union and the United States. The main idea is about how both of those countries enter into World War II and who they fight against. So why do both countries eventually join the conflict? As you can see by the map over here, by the spring of 1940, Germany had essentially conquered all of Western Europe. So they had control of this entire region here. They had control of the Atlantic seaboard, so control of trade with the Atlantic Ocean. There's control of the Mediterranean Sea, and they also have dominance over the Balkan Peninsula. So Germany and Italy are doing quite well about a year into this war. They also have assistance from neutral Spain. Spain is a fascist country, just like Germany and Italy were. And so Spain gave control and use of their ports over to Germany for their submarines and their growing navy. To make things even more complicated and worse for the Allies was that Japan, who was in the Pacific, had now joined the Axis powers as well, and it was essentially a big three of Germany, Italy, and Japan that were extending their influence around the globe. At this point, Germany is going to start invading Northern Africa and also the Middle East. It's going to invade these regions because it wants to expand their colonial control and power, and also wants to acquire more resources and control over important logistical areas. An example of that would be the Suez Canal, which is located right here. If you control this, you can take ships from the Mediterranean Sea and link them to the Red Sea, which would bring you to the Indian Ocean. So you don't need to sail all the way around Africa. So it's a really vital spot, and Germany is going to try and conquer parts of the Middle East and North Africa to get control of this. At the time, it's being controlled by Britain. Egypt, where the Suez Canal is located, had been a colony of Britain for a long time. And so many Egyptians were actually supporting the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, when they tried to conquer it and take over Egypt, because they were hoping to kick out Britain, who had been a colonial ruler and a pretty harsh one for a long period of time. Similarly, in Iraq, we're going to see the Axis powers trying to conquer this area here because it's got a ton of oil fields, and oil is obviously very vital for powering all the machines and tanks and transportation tools needed by the Axis military. So both areas will come under invasion at this point. And the leader of this invasion for Germany is a guy named Erwin Rommel, and he's going to be in charge of a lot of tank divisions, and they're going to have a lot of success conquering North Africa initially. But then they're eventually going to get gummed up and stopped right here at a place called El Alamein, which will be a massive battle in World War II, fought between the British and the Germans. And as a result of this battle, it'll halt the German expansion into Egypt and prevent them from conquering the Suez Canal. So this is one of a few major victories for the Allies at the beginning of the war, El Alamein. At the same time as Germany starting to expand into North Africa and try and take control of the Suez Canal and the Middle East, it's also going to invade the USSR, which is the Soviet Union. This is a big surprise, or I guess it really wasn't a surprise, but it's a big game-changing event because the Soviets and the Germans, the Nazis, had signed a non-aggression pact, meaning that they were not going to fight each other during World War II, but clearly Germany has just broken this pact. So they invade the Soviet Union without declaring war, and they launched this massive 2,000-mile-long invasion across the border of the Soviet Union. And as a result, supplies that Britain and the United States wanted to send the Soviet Union so they could stop this invasion is cut off because it's such a widespread invasion. So this is a big event here. Russia's now brought into the war, and the non-aggression pact is over. To defend itself from this Nazi juggernaut, Russia turns to an old strategy that it had used against Napoleon over 100 years earlier, and that's the scorched earth policy. When the Soviets knew that a foreign power was going to come into Russia and try and take it over, instead of allowing their towns to be captured and letting the foreign invaders take their resources, civilians would just take all their stuff, their food, whatever they could carry. They'd run away from the army, and as they ran away, they would burn their towns or their homes down so that any resources that were available that they left behind would be destroyed. And that way, the country invading wouldn't be able to keep them and use them for their invasion. So this photo down here shows a Russian village and some Russian civilians taking their resources as they flee the invading Nazi army, and they're burning down their towns so that there's no resources left behind that can be absorbed by the Axis powers. While the civilians are fleeing, the Germans get further and further into Russia, but they also are running out of resources and supplies. And by the time the Nazis run out of all their resources, it's probably going to be winter or close to winter, and they're going to be in a lot of trouble because now they're in the middle of Russia with no resources, and the winters in Russia are quite harsh. Another thing that the Russians did was they would launch guerrilla war tactics. So as the Germans are marching, they would have small, brave groups of civilians and soldiers that would at night attack the German army, and then they'd run away before the German army could attack them back. So a lot of like hidden run sort of sneak attacks that chipped away at the German military over time. These are really small battles, but when they happen all the time, they can have a pretty significant impact. So Germany's marching into the Soviet Union, and they begin to struggle at this as this massive invasion, which starts off quite successfully, starts to slow down. Initially, they're focusing in the northern part of Russia, and where Moscow and Leningrad, two major cities, are. But Germany's going to fail to capture and conquer those cities. And so after 2 long sieges, it realizes that it's running out of resources and won't be able to take those cities. So then they focus their attention south, and they begin to invade south, trying to get access to these oil fields that are in the southern part of Russia. And as they're doing this, it's now winter, and it's starting to get very cold, and all this guerrilla warfare is really starting to demoralize the German army, and they're running out of supplies. So German soldiers are starving to death, they're freezing to death, and yet they're still being forced to fight. And as they're on their way to these southern oil fields, they come across this major city called Stalingrad, and they're going to begin to fight there in the spring of 1942. And Stalingrad will eventually be one of the major turning points of World War II. So we'll kind of leave off there. Things aren't going that great for Germany finally in this war, and they're kind of stuck fighting in the Soviet Union in this really tough area. Now, if we focus on Japan, the other part of World War II takes place in the Pacific, and Japan's going to have a whole bunch of aggressive actions that it does early in the war. It's going to continue to push its invasion into China. So we have this map here, and all things that are blue are areas under Japanese control. It's also going to use the fighting taking place in the European theater to conquer all these countries in Southeast Asia. Most of these countries here were colonies of European powers like Britain and France, and they're clearly occupied by Germany and Italy. And so they're vulnerable for being conquered, and Japan will come down and conquer these countries here. And as we talked about earlier in 1940, Japan will become part of the Axis powers. So they're doing a lot of really aggressive things. The other major power in the Pacific is the United States, and the United States is going to respond to all this Japanese aggression in 3 ways. The first is they're going to complain that Japan is violating this thing called the Nine Powers Treaty. It was a treaty signed in the 1920s by 9 different countries, basically saying that they're going to honor the sovereignty or the independence of China, which clearly isn't happening because Japan is invading and conquering China. As a result, the second thing the United States is going to do is they're going to provide aid to the Chinese nationalists. So these are people that are in China fighting against the Japanese invaders. And so we're going to give weapons and food, as much resources as we can to help them fight against the Japanese. And then we're also going to embargo or cut off trade with Japan, and we're no longer going to give them oil and scrap iron. And these are 2 things that Japan needed because they're on an island and they lack a lot of natural resources on this island. And so they've been dependent upon U.S. trade of these resources. But since Japan was being aggressive, we cut off trade with an embargo. And this severely upsets Japan, and they realize that they kind of need to take care of the United States and get access to more resources, or to kick us out of the picture so they can continue to dominate the Pacific. Their new leader was a guy named Hideki Tojo, and he's the premier of Japan, so like their main leader. And he was very militaristic. He's a former general. And so he's going to believe that, the United States must be taken care of and gotten rid of so Japan can continue to conquer the Pacific. And they're going to prepare for a massive sneak attack against the United States. And they felt their best way of knocking the U.S. out of any possible war was to destroy their fleet, which was stationed in Pearl Harbor right here. So Hawaii, Pearl Harbor is a naval base in Hawaii. Most of the U.S. Navy was in Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese felt they could have a sneak attack. They could destroy most of the Navy, making it hard for the U.S. to ever really stop this Japanese expansion into the Pacific. And as most of you probably know, Japan will indeed attack Pearl Harbor. It'll take place on December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. And Japan launches this massive surprise bombing raid against this American naval base. And it's going to be pretty devastating towards the U.S. Navy. It's going to sink many of our battleships, but not our aircraft carriers, which we'll talk about in a later lecture, which is important. and over 2,300 soldiers at this naval base will be killed. So it is a pretty devastating attack. It's the largest attack on U.S. soil until 9/11. And this is going to rally many Americans who were U.S. was neutral at this point and didn't really want to fight in World War II. But as a result of this attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States is going to declare war against Japan. And then Germany and Italy, who are allies with Japan, will declare war against the United States. And now the United States is fighting against all three powers. And so the United States went from being neutral, and then Pearl Harbor happens. And now we are at war with all three of the Axis countries. It's important to note that when Pearl Harbor takes place and we are being preoccupied by this invasion, Japan uses this opportunity of our weakened Navy to capture a lot of U.S. colonies and territories of influence in the Pacific. So Guam and the Philippines, two U.S. colonies, are captured by the Japanese, and Japan extends its influence to Luzon, Burma, Thailand, Malaya, and Indonesia, and are basically getting ready to invade Australia as well when the U.S. is starting to rebuild its Navy to fight and strike back.